because I want to start with something which is not actually Algeria or France. I want to start here on this continent, a little bit closer to home, as a way of trying to get into this. The author William Cronon was someone who had a big influence on my own understanding of ecology. And he wrote about, in his book Changes in the Land, the Native American versus settler land use, right, in colonial New England. So in the early 17th century, what happened when people came from abroad with very specific notions of what they wanted to do in this place and confronted other people who'd already lived there and had ways of life that had existed for generations, at least, if not for centuries. And what happened when this sort of confrontation came to a head? Because in effect, this is the kind of dynamic that becomes accelerated, in a sense, in the 19th century. So Cronon coined the term the ecological transformation of colonial New England. And what he discussed was the way that colonial settlement brought forward very distinct notions about environment and property and the relationship of the human habitation to the world. Right? There are cultural differences and prejudices that existed, of course, but the fundamentally different understanding of what labor means, what work means, what does it mean to work the land, to make a living off of the land. What kind of living are we trying to make? And what's the importance of productivity? Productivity was the catchword for the European settlers, the people who wanted to come and make this land fruitful, as if it wasn't fruitful enough already. The early descriptions which Cronon relates about the incredible amount of game, the amount of fish, the amount of wild growing berries and flora is just phenomenal. And so what more do we need? What good are humans to make that kind of place productive, right? In a sense, the settlers were looking for an excuse. They really believed that that land belonged to the King of England and that had been granted to them and those people who lived there while they were just deluded. But there was also, a really fundamental underlying shift about how to exist in this huge and relatively lightly populated continent, right? What would you make do with this? The idea of making nature serve our ends, right? This very European sensibility, a very Protestant sensibility, really, versus the idea that we have a kind of nomadic and interactive approach to the environment. You have farmland, sure, but you don't live there all the time. You move around seasonally. You hunt in different places every year. And place names actually refer to things that you do there, often are very descriptive. So ecology in this sense was not only a use of land, but an engagement with place, a sort of responsiveness and understanding, in effect, what the world had to offer and how you could live in that in a fruitful way. Of course, making a living was based on making a living in that world that we're living in, right? Our sense of making a living now has very different connotations. And the idea of harvesting from this natural bounty was very different then than it is today. It's hard to even articulate what was lost in terms of the alternative conceptions of this universe. As you start to stack up this sort of information available, you realize that there isn't any real sense. There's no, there isn't these written texts that you can go back to, as you can with the European settlers, to see what they're doing. Cronon does a lot of very good detective work, I think, to try to determine how these ideas are different. But in a sense, that alternative is lost to us, and that's what colonialism is really about. It's about stamping out an alternative view in order to replace it with a particular and very specific notion. Our notion, the European notion, about valorizing human civilization, about the building of towns in the vast wilderness, right? Even as we valorize our landscape, we nevertheless view it as a kind of natural resource, right? If you think about those valiant prospects of Albert Bierstadt or many 19th century American painters, you think about these wonderful prospects, these great opportunities. You don't think about the people who lived there or how they lived. You think about what we could do if we were there. Tocqueville famously said, whenever an American sees a tree, he thinks of an axe, right? The idea of trees and axes go together. There's a kind of productivity involved from looking at a great forest. And the way in which we interact with that is tied to a kind of progress, right? We're going to move forward. We're going to develop our society. We're going to push civilization along. And it's a myth that really continues to guide our practices here in the United States, where whether we like that or not, we have a sense of the picture of nature as being a place where we're going to put ourselves, where we're going to make use of that. So my research is about a totally different place. It's about French colonialism in the 19th century. Algeria was conquered at first and then colonized by the French. It really wasn't Algeria when they got there. It was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. They had a sort of control of the coastal cities where they just taxed and sort of skimmed a little off the top. The French had a totally different idea about what they could do there. And, you know, there are a lot of complicated aspects to the colonialism, the way in which they fell into a much bigger area of control than they had originally imagined. At first they just wanted to conquer this town, and then people from abroad started to attack, and then they had to conquer more and more. And so then, you know, a nationalist movement grew up to counter their military authority. And it became a country. It became colonized. But it is fundamentally similar in the sense that they were asserting an authority over space. And that mechanism wasn't still being worked out as it was in the 17th century in New England. It was pretty well established. They knew how they needed to do it. They had the military force to do it, and they had the organization that would make this possible. So in effect, they too were going to eradicate those places that previously existed in order to replace them with a kind of bounded space, a space that was measured, a space that could be mapped. They had a project to give all of the natives that were organized in tribal units to divide up their collective land and give a parcel out to each male member of the tribe so that those parcels could be bought and sold. They had wonderful visions of private property, of bestowing the civilization upon those poor, unwitting folks who lived there. And once again, I mean, there's no way, in effect, of representing the alternative perspective. That it's been eradicated from history, right? What we can tell, though, is the story about how this happened and what kind of developments ensued, how artists were, in effect, involved with it. The first artists in Algeria were soldiers.